Sure.
You're live. Okay. There we go. Okay. Very good. So, welcome everyone. And so I thought this year that I would change things up with how we would do the evening adult education class and just do a first Wednesday of the month class that would be about contemporary issues. But I thought that we would spend more time talking about this book that just came out about conservative Judaism. It's called, trying to get it there on the camera, Modern Conservative Judaism by Elliot Dorff, Evolving Thought and Practice. So I recommend the book. Obviously, it's available in paperback, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's so cheap because it's published by the Jewish Publication Society. And though you can get it on Amazon, there aren't that great discounts with it. Obviously, when I scheduled this first Wednesday series, I was thinking, do I want to do this class tonight, right after all the holidays are over? Figured, why not? I should be able to talk about this in my sleep, which is almost what I feel like tonight. But because conservative Judaism is who I am, it's how I was brought up. But I think it's there are issues here from the book that will take us through March to talk about issues that that caring, thinking Jews are supposed to think about all the time anyway. So we'll have a little background tonight. We'll talk about God in November. We'll talk about prayer in December. We'll talk about Torah in January. We'll talk about Israel in February. And then we'll talk about this concept that Dorff finishes off the book with. What is the ideal conservative Jew? So let's see. So conservative Judaism. We have to understand a couple of things, and feel free to interrupt. And those who are watching online, I can't tell if anybody's watching online. There's chat on the right-hand side. You can just type in a question, and I'll be able to see that question and hopefully be able to answer it. So interrupt at any time. So conservative Judaism, like all the denominations of Judaism, that includes Orthodox. So Orthodox, Reform, conservative Judaism all began in the middle of the 19th century. So we might think that the people wearing the black coats and the black hats with the payas and the tzitzit hanging out are what they call themselves as the Torah true Jews or the authentic Jews. That's how Judaism was all the time. That is not the case. Judaism until the middle of the 1800s was just Judaism, because it was by the middle of the 1800s that Jews were allowed to be citizens of the countries that they were living in. Until that time, they were allowed to live anywhere they wanted in that country. They were allowed to go to university. They were allowed to own land. They were allowed to be elected to parliament. They were allowed to have any profession open to them. Now, granted, there was anti-Semitism and perhaps there were quotas in universities, things like that. But until that time, that was not the case. Jews lived in the ghetto. Jews were subject to the whims of the ruler of whatever country or empire that they were living in. Their taxes would be severe or not so severe. Their restrictions would be severe or not so severe, but there would be restrictions on what they could wear, where they could live, what they could do, and etc. So Jews at that time could only live in the ghetto.
This was in the middle of?
This was in Europe, where Jews were living until the 1800s.
Oh, until
the 1800s, right? So the French Revolution in 1789, thank you, in 1789, and then After the French Revolution, Napoleon raised the question, what to do about the Jews. There's liberté, égalité, fraternité. Does it apply to the Jews? So that he had a whole separate, what he called a Sanhedrin of officials, rabbis come to meet to prove to him that Jews, that liberty, fraternity, equality should apply to Jews too. And that question wasn't answered until the early 1800s. So everybody else, the king was guillotined and whatnot in the 1790s, but it wasn't until 10, 20 years later in France that it applied to Jews. And then once it applied to Jews in France, then that wave spread to Germany and other countries in Europe, or empires in Europe, whatever the map looked like in Europe at that time. And so before 1789, Jews were living in the ghetto in Europe. In America, it was a different question, right? So Jews arrived in America in 1654, one boatload from Brazil, escaping the Inquisition, which had made it to the New World, to Brazil. And then these Jews on a boat from Recife, Brazil, arrived in New Amsterdam Harbor in 1654. So the question of Jews in America, totally different than Jews in Europe, okay? And so we have 6 synagogues by the time George Washington is inaugurated, who all send a joint letter congratulating President Washington on being elected president of the United States. And in the response to the 6 synagogues, which were in Newport, Rhode Island, in New York City, in Philadelphia, in Charleston, Richmond, Virginia, and Savannah, Georgia. Those are the 6 synagogues at the time. In response to them, he guaranteed freedom to the Jews. So so that's when was he elected? 1780. What was it? That's a.
Also 1776.
So 1776 was the Revolutionary War. That's a Declaration of Independence. No, 1789. 1789. So the same time. This is really a test of our knowledge here. Nobody's typing furiously on like, hey, it's 1789. Yes. So to get back, so what we have in Judaism until the ghetto walls were broken down was either the only differences in Judaism at that time, you're either an Ashkenazi Jew or a Sephardi Jew, stuck in the ghetto wherever you live. So you're following Ashkenazi traditions, Central Eastern European traditions, following rabbis who live there. And there are, of every generation, there is a chief rabbi, not that that rabbi was elected by the Ashkenazi community or the Sephardi community, but that rabbi was just more prolific, more scholarly than the other rabbis, and they would be known as like the head of Ashkenazi Jewry or Sephardi Jewry. Sephardic Jewry from Spain or Holland or Northern Africa, wherever the Muslim Empire had spread. So that's what Judaism was like. Once the ghetto walls were broken down, once Jews were allowed to become full citizens and partake of the freedom of being a French or German citizen, then there are challenges to the Jewish community because Jews had never faced those issues before since Roman times. In the time of the Roman Empire, before the temple was destroyed, there were Jews who were acting like Romans, and Jews living in Rome itself who were actually influencing Roman citizens about Jewish practice, and there were Roman citizens, non-Jews, who were acting like Jews. There was a Latin term for that, and I don't remember the term offhand, but those Roman citizens who were influenced by Jewish values, and there's many stories in rabbinic literature, especially in the Talmud, of rabbis who had gone on missions to Rome. So we don't know if this is accurate or not. We don't have corroborating evidence from Roman history of rabbis traveling to Rome. But in Jewish literature, we have it, and trying to teach Torah to the daughter of Caesar or to Caesar himself, as if such rabbis would have such influence within the Roman Empire. But it possibly reflects the idea that there was crossover, and that Jews and Romans would interact, and that would influence one another. There are elements of Roman legal philosophy and Roman general philosophy that got integrated into rabbinic literature and into Judaism at that time. But since then, because of Jews living in the ghetto, that wasn't the case until the middle of the 1800s. And now Judaism is faced with a challenge. How do you respond in this modern world with Jewish practice? So that's where the denominations came from. First, Reform Judaism, saying, let's take total advantage of being free citizens of France and Germany and give up on anything that would distinguish us from everybody else. So no need to keep kosher anymore, because keeping kosher would make us different than anybody else. No need to have Shabbat on Saturday. That distinguishes us from everybody else. Let's have Shabbat on Sunday. Let's not pray in Hebrew. That distinguishes us. Let's pray in French or in German. Let's give up some beliefs also that make us different than everybody else, because this caused Napoleon to wait a while to determine that Jews could be citizens of France, because the question of, well, aren't you praying for a return to Jerusalem and to the reestablishment of the state of Israel? What kind of French citizens would you be if you're praying for that? So in Reform Judaism, classic Reform, not Reform today, but classic Reform Judaism, they gave up on an attachment to Israel and the belief in the Messiah that would involve return to Israel, because it impacted their thought that they wanted to be full citizens of France, and nobody should question them. So Reform Judaism is different today, but there are, when Theodor Herzl had the first Zionist Congress, 1897, and Jews in America were debating as to whether to join or not, there were many in the Reform movement who were anti-Zionist, because of this classic Reform idea that we don't want to do anything that would make us different from being the citizens of the country that we're living in. So most Reform Jews today, and certainly the ideology of the Reform movement today, is Zionist, and they have a Zionist party, Artza, just like a conservative movement has a Zionist party called Merkaz, and it's different today. But our point in this class is to show how conservative Judaism has evolved over time, but I just want to give the background for where it came from. So Reform came first, saying let's be just like French or German citizens. Orthodox Judaism came next, saying no, we don't have to give up anything in order to be full French. Let's be proud of our identity, and let's continue practicing the way we've been practicing. So Samson Raphael Hirsch is one of those who is also wrote a commentary on the Bible, but he was one of the leaders of the and founders of what is known today as Orthodox Judaism. Conservative Judaism came next. That was the third of the three denominations that started, and it wasn't even called Conservative Judaism for quite some time. What it was called, and this is a bizarre name, just like Conservative Judaism is a bizarre name too, because you think of political terms, does that mean we're conservative or politically as opposed to liberal? Right. So I'll get to the name in a second. And this, okay. So I'm not going to be saying such rah-rah pro-conservative Judaism things here. Just going to be explaining what the issues are. So it was started as positive historical Judaism. Something to rally around to understand exactly what that means. What is positive historical Judaism? What does that mean? So there's a rabbi from Breslau, Germany, which is not in Germany anymore. It's not called Breslau anymore because I think it's in Poland now. But there used to be a rabbinical academy there, not a yeshiva, it wasn't Orthodox, but a rabbinical academy. And Rabbi Zacharias Frankel, who's a graduate of their rabbinical school, and others who are not so happy with how Reform Judaism was ending up, being so non-traditional and anti-Hebrew and anti-Israel, but they also weren't Orthodox because they didn't want to maintain the same traditional values that have been carried forward from one generation to the next. The positive historical school means that the academic rigors and scientific study of the world around us, and by scientific study, I don't mean physics or chemistry. I mean applying tools of study, testing hypotheses about history, about sociology, about literature, applying those methods of study to Judaism. And these rabbis are saying, yes, Judaism is open to this kind of study as well, and that Judaism can withstand it, because if we don't study in this way, then people who are living out there, common French Jews or German Jews, who if that's how they're being taught in school and in university, and see that their religion is not adapting, they'll say that the religion is old and dead. That was the thought for Zacharias Frankel and other rabbis of his ilk. And so they said Judaism can withstand that, can withstand the study and the scrutiny and the academic rigors, and that we need to apply all of those standards of study to Jewish text as well, even the Torah and other Jewish traditions. So whereas Orthodox Jews would say that the Torah and the Talmud, that is rabbinic literature, even down into the Middle Ages, came from God to Moses at Mount Sinai, well, from an academic perspective, that's ridiculous. Everybody can know that that's not. How can you say that Rashi, who lived in France, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki, who lived in France 1,000 years ago, learned what he learned from Moses at Mount Sinai directly, like God spoke to him? Rashi himself wouldn't say that, but that's Orthodox Jews at the time would say that about Rashi, that even his commentary, you can't question his commentary. Everything that he brought forward in his commentary was taught to Moses at Mount Sinai, which means it's immutable. You can't change it. You have to accept it as is. And academic study, that's not what that's about. Academic study is all about not accepting it for what it is, but rather understanding what the history is, what the context is, understanding the language and other things like that, and understanding the development of Judaism. So that, in its key component, is what conservative Judaism is. The understanding that we are just another generation of people who take Judaism seriously and study it and make changes when necessary. We'll get into those changes in these different areas in the months ahead in God, Prayer, Torah, Israel. But I just wanted to provide that back. So that's in Europe in the 1850s, 60s. A little bit later, in the early 1880s, when there are pogroms in Russia, when waves of Jews are starting to come to America from 1881, 1924, those Jews weren't necessarily going to be conservative Jews when they came to America. They brought their kind of Orthodox or traditional upbringing with them to America. The founders of conservative Judaism in America, influenced by Frankel in Europe, the correspondence back and forth, not automatic with email and the internet as it is today, But they, scholars here in America, knew what was going on in Europe, and there were journals and whatnot. So the founders of conservative Judaism in the 1880s, who founded the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1886, were Sephardic rabbis. So in fact, the rabbi of Mikveh Israel, one of the original 6 synagogues, which was a Sephardi synagogue in Philadelphia, still there today. It's where the Museum of American Jewish History is housed, right next to that synagogue. So the rabbi of Mikveh Israel became one of the first presidents. In fact, the first 2 presidents of the Jewish Theological Seminary were rabbis from Mikveh Israel. And the supporters that made that happen, that contributed, bought the building and whatnot, were German Jews who had been here already. Okay, so so conservative Judaism in America started by Sephardic Jews who were here already and German Jews who were here already, who felt themselves a little bit more sophisticated than these newbies coming over who didn't quite look like them. They weren't, they're just new immigrants, and whether speaking Yiddish and not quite Americanized yet. There was, and I'm being very politically nice about it. There was bad blood between the German Jews who are here already and these new immigrants coming in. There were organizations here set up to help the new immigrants, the new Jewish immigrants, but the people who were here already were kind of embarrassed by these new immigrants coming in. It took a while for them to, it took for there to be thousands upon thousands of immigrants to overtake the numbers of Jews here, so that there was no choice but to be nice to them. So it wasn't until the 2nd or 3rd generation after these Jews coming from Eastern Europe to America who became part of the conservative movement. And it became known as conservative Judaism by Solomon Schechter when he became president in 1903 of the seminary, and then United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism was established in 1913 by Solomon Schechter. So the conservative movement then in America and in Europe started in the Rabbinical Academy by ideas by rabbis formulating a response to what it means to live in this modern world today, not living in a ghetto. So they didn't start synagogues. They didn't start the movement by saying, let's start by building synagogues and then see what happens. No, in America, they built the Rabbinical Academy first, the Jewish Theological Seminary first. And then in the early 1900s, then there were synagogues who joined the seminary. So from the start, it wasn't a groundswell. It wasn't a grassroots movement among the people that Reform Judaism really was in America, but rather it started top down. And an issue then, so the foundational element of conservative Judaism is that in every generation we study the texts and traditions of our people with modern scientific methods and apply that to Jewish practice today. That's essentially what conservative Judaism is. And again, I'll get into more details of that in the sessions ahead. And then there was synagogues that kind of bought into that kind of idea. And there were rabbis who were either trained at the seminary or other rabbis who joined in with the movement. In the 40s and the 50s, a lot of the rabbis in the movement, including my predecessor, may he rest in peace, were trained Orthodox and then became members of the rabbinical organization of the conservative movement, the Rabbinical Assembly, because rabbis felt at that time, well, Orthodox synagogues are small, and at the time, it wasn't egalitarian yet. So, but there was no mechitza. So Orthodox rabbis who became members of the rabbinical assembly would have to compromise. Okay, I'll have to use a microphone, and there won't be a mechitza, but otherwise it's the same kind of traditional service. And I get to talk in English. I don't have to talk in Yiddish, like some Orthodox synagogues were still doing in the 50s. So many Orthodox, my father graduated the seminary in 1959. Some of his colleagues in seminary had gone to Yeshiva University for college, but others who joined the Rabbinical Assembly in 1959 were those who were ordained Orthodox someplace else, and then became members of the Rabbinical Assembly that way. Again, there wasn't much. You had a compromise on electricity and on no mechitza, which is really not much of a compromise when you think about it, compared to how different conservative Judaism is today from Orthodox Judaism. So that's any questions so far about the, yes, Marie?
When did they change the name from positive historical
So it wasn't
conservative, and how did they choose the word?
right. So yeah, so it wasn't really a change in name. The rabbis of Zacharias Frankel and others were writing as if they're saying positive historical approach. There wasn't really a movement yet. The movement really started when the Jewish Theological Seminary was established in 1886. And really, it took a while for it to, until Solomon Schechter was brought from Cambridge University to become president in 1903. And then he and his wife, Matilda, were instrumental in building the building blocks of the movement. Matilda Schechter, I don't think the building exists anymore. The seminary, I think, might have sold it to with the new development of their property. But there's the Matilda Schechter dorm. She was instrumental in founding Women's League for Conservative Judaism. That's what we know as sisterhood. And Solomon Schechter, besides the seminary, knew, well, we need synagogues for our graduates to work at. So he worked hard to build a system of synagogues, which became known as the United Synagogue for Conservative Judaism. So he and the board of the seminary and this new lay organization came up with the name Conservative Judaism. But Solomon Schechter, at the time, Conservative Judaism made sense. People knew that meant preserving Judaism. But Solomon Schechter also came up with this idea of Catholic Israel, where you're thinking, what? How could a rabbi be talking about Catholic Israel? But Catholic, not in terms of not Protestant, but Catholic or Roman Catholic. No, Catholic also means all of, the community of. So he just thought, as a scholar, everybody would know what he's talking about when he's writing about how important it is to build this community of Israel. And in Hebrew, it's called Klal Yisrael, the entirety of Israel. And in English, he called it Catholic Israel. So for the new person reading about this, what? But 100 years ago, they used words like that we might not have thought about using today. So yeah, Barbara.
Well, was it part of the thing that gave it conservative Judaism a push was that there was an affair that the Reformed had some kind of graduation or something. And they were having all kinds of seafood and stuff.
Yes.
And they felt that this was just going too far.
Yes. So what Barbara's bringing out is the Pittsburgh platform and what is known as the Treifa dinner. So, okay. So, like I said, in Europe, the response of Zacharias Frankel was to how too far their colleagues were going in terms of making changes to Judaism, including advocating not praying in Hebrew and not praying for a return to Israel. in America, you had Hebrew Union College, which was established 10 years or more before the Jewish Theological Seminary. So they're training rabbis for new American synagogues, and the Hebrew Union College was in Cincinnati, and they had synagogues. The HUC, Hebrew Union College, also has a campus in New York today, but that was established after Cincinnati. So it started in Cincinnati by Isaac Mayer Wise and others. And they had this dinner in Pittsburgh in 1885 where they're serving treif. So it's treif meaning not kosher food. And it's not like it was kosher style, but still not kosher because it wasn't slaughtered properly. No, there was turtle soup. You can go online and Google the menu of the treifa dinner, and you'll see that it was more than just turtle soup first. There's other stuff, other seafood being served there. So to say, okay, we're buying into this idea that we don't need to keep kosher anymore. Keeping kosher doesn't mean that you're a good Jew. For Reform Judaism, it's all about the ethical and moral values that the prophets teach and that we find in the Torah, but mainly find in the prophets. That's classical Reform Judaism, and that's what it means to be a good Jew. Follow Micah. What does God expect of you? Do good, act justly, follow and walk humbly in my ways. So, okay, so that's pretty generic, and everybody can do that. And that's what Reform Judaism was teaching. So what do you need? If you want, you can keep kosher. So it's individual choice. So at this banquet, so it created an uproar, and that though some people were going along with what the Reform leadership was saying, rabbis were saying about these ideological ideas, when it came to a menu and actually eating a dinner, whoa, that's going too far. I can't hang out with these people anymore because I need to keep kosher. So those rabbis, so the Sephardic rabbis and others said, we need to start an alternative American movement. So based on the ideas of Zacharias Frankel and based on this treifa banquet and other ideas happening here in America, the seminary was established in 1886, but it wasn't until 17 years later, 1903, when Solomon Schechter came, that it really got off the ground. Mordechai Kaplan is a name also associated with Reconstructionist Judaism, but he's a graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary. The first graduates of the Jewish Theological Seminary also served Orthodox synagogues. So the Hertz Chumash, the blue Chumash that we used to use before we got the red one. So Hertz, he was chief rabbi of the British Empire, is a graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary. Mordechai Kaplan, who, like I said, established Reconstructionist Judaism in the 40s and 50s, is a graduate of the seminary and taught at the seminary until he was in his 80s and 90s. He first served an Orthodox synagogue in Manhattan. And he founded Young Israel of Orthodox Judaism today, which is very black hat, right? Young Israel Shomrei Emunah in Kent Mill, for example, pretty traditional Orthodox place, which is more Orthodox than Kent Mill Synagogue in Kent Mill, right? So there are differences in style in these synagogues in Kent Mill. Young Israel Shomrei Emunah, everybody going there, black hat, white shirt, black pants. Kent Mill Synagogue dressed a little bit more like me going to synagogue, okay? So if I were to walk into Kent Mill Synagogue for a little bit, just walking in, people wouldn't tell that I'm not Orthodox. But if I were to walk in like this to Young Israel Shomrei Emunah, I'd stick out like a sore thumb. And I'm not meaning anything negative about saying that. Just maybe, I don't know. Young Israel Shomrei Emunah started as those people who didn't want. Was that? No, Southeast. It was was it Shomrei Emunah that started from those who didn't want to when Sharei Tefillah was formed. There were those when it became conservative. There are those who said no, we want to be Orthodox, and they started either Southeast or Shomrei Emunah.
Southeast. That came from Southeast.
Right. So anyway, so Young Israel, the Young Israel movement today was founded by Mordecai Kaplan. So just a sense of what happened long ago and where they're at today. So conservative Judaism then responding to how to live as a Jew in the modern world, understanding that we don't need to take such liberties that the Reform movement is taking, and we don't need to be as traditional as the Orthodox movement is maintaining. We can say, you know what, we're going to apply the rules of academic standards to Jewish religious practice. And that's what conservative Judaism is. So, any more questions or comments about
What
that?
is
Yes.
Reconstruction?
Okay, so Reconstructionist Judaism is a uniquely American movement, and it's the differences between the movements are not just about how much to apply academic standards and ways of study to. It's not just about how we study and applying that to Jewish text, but it's also about a relationship to Jewish law. Okay, and we'll get into that when we get to Torah in a couple of sessions from now. But in a nutshell, and I'll expand on it more in that session. In a nutshell, the idea is, do we need to observe Jewish law in order to be a good Jew? And what is the nature of Jewish law? So Orthodox Jews say, absolutely, yes, you need to observe Jewish law. And Jewish law is what we understand God giving to Moses at Mount Sinai. Both the oral law, that is the rabbis and how they understood the Torah, and the Torah itself given to Moses at Mount Sinai, totally authoritative and by God. Okay? The Reform movement says you don't need Jewish law at all to be Jewish. Okay, as I explained before. Conservative Judaism says, yes, you need Jewish law, but it's not all of it is from Moses at Mount Sinai, and maybe even Moses wasn't there at Mount Sinai. It's all about an evolution of practice. Okay, but it is authoritative because it is a sacred text of our tradition. But we have the right to study and interpret it all the time and possibly make changes to it. Reconstructionist Judaism says it's not law. It was never considered law. It was considered what Mordecai Kaplan called sancta, these holy practices that aren't just customs. Like, in other words, he understood society. He studied society in an anthropological way, and applying anthropological standards to Jewish culture. And like comparing it to American culture or British culture or French culture. And so just as there are things that you do to show that you are typically French. So I don't know what that would be. Drink wine at every meal. Okay, I don't know. But is that uniquely French? I don't know. Is there something that you do that is uniquely French, a uniquely French thing to do? So if you can think of that those kinds of custom things that are uniquely American to do, to play baseball or to have a barbecue. Okay, these are American customs, right? So they're the things that Jews do. Shaking a lulav and an etrog is considered just like having a barbecue on 4th of July. Okay, it's just something that you would do. You couldn't imagine not doing, right? It would be. Some of us get more into barbecues than others, or watching fireworks on 4th of July. You always want to do that, right? And there are some people just make an effort, no matter where they are, gotta watch fireworks. So the lulav, is that holy? It's not a holy thing, but it's uniquely American. So that's how Mordecai Kaplan understood the ritual practices of Judaism. That they are like that, but they're a little bit more than that. That's why he called them sancta. It's a way to connect not just to your fellow Jew, but to try to experience God. So these are customs and practices that are defined by the community, and every community has the authority to establish their practices that they think are important for them. So that's Reconstructionist Judaism in a nutshell, that it's not law, it's sancta. Okay, so their movement, and now they're called Reconstructing Judaism. They officially changed their name a year ago from Reconstructionist to Reconstructing. So
By way of example, we
Yeah.
have friends who belong to Reconstructing
yes,
Synagogue, and they, as a community, they set what the religious laws are.
right.
So they wanted it, they had us, in their synagogue, they had a kitchen, it was a kosher kitchen. But they wanted to serve other food, and the rabbi didn't want to do it. So they got together and they compromised, and they put up another building.
Wow.
And in that building, they do not eat kosher. So
Uh-huh.
if they have an affair,
Wow.
they go over to that building
Right.
and eat.
Right.
Because they made the decision.
That's right. So that's the way Reconstructing Judaism works. That it's a more of a democracy and more of understanding that these practices come out of the community itself as ways of expressing their religious beliefs and ideas. Yes, Barbara.
Reconstructing, didn't they also were the ones that introduced bat mitzvahs?
Right. So Mordecai Kaplan's daughter is the first bat mitzvah in North America in 1922. And yes, so Mordecai Kaplan. So again, remember, this is a man who graduated the Jewish Theological Seminary and became a rabbi of an Orthodox synagogue, and then wrote. Then his daughter became bat mitzvah in 1922, and wrote Judaism as a Civilization, which is a classic text on understanding all of these ideas are expressed in there. It's very, very thick book. It's not bedtime reading. Well, actually, it could be if you want to go to sleep. But it's a classic work of the time. And so you're taking modern American values and incorporating them into Judaism. So which Mordecai Kaplan and Reconstructionist and Reform Judaism is very willing to do, and takes the conservative movement a while to do. I just realized I have this whole stack of books here that are all about conservative Judaism or a response to conservative Judaism. So one thing that Elliot Dorff says in this book is that there is no one official text of the conservative movement that defines what the conservative movement is. That from 1886 until the centennial in 1986, it took 100 years for them to publish this. Okay, this pamphlet, the Red Book, Emet ve'emunah, which means truth and faith, the statement of principles of conservative Judaism. So there was a committee that got together, and this is 1988, and the chancellor of the seminary, the president of the Rabbinical Assembly, the president of the United Synagogue. Here it is. It's mainly rabbis who are on this committee, and a few non-rabbis, faculty members, no cantor. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That's ex officio. There are two cantors who are ex officio members of the committee. So it took them 3 years working together to come up with, to agree on what everybody would think conservative Judaism is. So it took 100 years to publish this. Then at the same time as that, they published a course guide. So I put it inside a binder that says Wang on it, which was a computer company in Massachusetts, based in Lowell, Massachusetts, where I was. So I had a number of these binders in my synagogue office from people who worked at Wang, and I was able to put the course guide that came wrapped in cellophane into a binder. And I used this for a couple of years in teaching classes. But before that, the text that most people refer to was this one by Rabbi Mordechai Waxman of Temple Israel in Great Neck, past president of the Rabbinical Assembly, called Tradition and Change. So that, because he came up with the title, that became like the motto of conservative Judaism, tradition and change. So some people today are trying to come up with like a tagline for what conservative Judaism is. Nobody has been able to agree on a tagline for that. And it's tradition and change. So it's essays from leading rabbinic figures at his time, and also papers from the law committee of the conservative movement, which I'll talk about in a little bit in a future session. And again, it's just Mordechai Waxman. It's not like the official book of the conservative movement. It's just Mordechai Waxman who decided to publish that on his own, and then all conservative Jews would have that as a text. So I haven't opened that since rabbinical school. Okay, so then there's another book. So Rabbi Isaac Klein of a synagogue in Buffalo, also may he rest in peace, wrote this book, A Guide to Jewish Religious Practice, just still for sale. And sometimes it was given to bar and bat mitzvah boys and girls as a text, and would sit on their shelf. But because it's very hard to read, it's like a summary of Jewish law from a conservative movement perspective. So it's very dense and would explain issues of kashrut. So there would be something in here about swordfish, so which would be a modern approach to understanding, or can you eat out as a conservative Jew, can you eat out in a non-kosher restaurant? So that would be in there, but it's also everything else that a traditional Jew would do. So there is not much difference in that book from how an Orthodox Jew would practice. And it was published in the 1960s. Recently, an even thicker volume was published. This is called The Observant Life. And this is from the Rabbinical Assembly. So this is an official book published by the Rabbinical Assembly just a few years ago, which is supposed to take the place of this book. Okay, so this is a little bit more modern approach to how to have the wisdom of conservative Judaism for contemporary Jews. But it's not about theology, it's about Jewish practice. Okay, so it's a very thick book, but it's much easier read. And I have referenced this book a few times. But when I was in rabbinical school, there was that Tradition and Change, and there was this other pamphlet that Simon Greenberg, who was a rabbi in Philadelphia at Har Zion before he became the vice chancellor of the seminary, he wrote this, The Conservative Movement in Judaism, an Introduction. But he just wrote that on his own. It was the National Academy for Adult Jewish Studies and published by the United Synagogue of America. So he wrote it on behalf of the United Synagogue. So just a small pamphlet at that time.
They accepted it, they published it.
Well, yes, I guess so. Then Marshall Sclair wrote this sociological study about conservative Judaism back in the 50s, an American religious movement, conservative Judaism. So because conservative Judaism was the largest denomination in America for the longest time, it was studied in this classic sociological study. It looks almost brand new. So my father actually did work for him when he was in rabbinical school. So my father served a a summer pulpit in Alpena, Michigan for 2 summers, and wrote about his experience there for a class he took with Marshall Sclair at the seminary. There was this book by Seymour Siegel, who was chairman of the law committee of the conservative movement for a while, who wrote this book, Conservative Judaism and Jewish Law, back in the 70s. And then Robert Gordis, who was the chairman of that red volume, Emet Ve'emunah, a Bible professor, the grandfather of Rabbi Daniel Gordis, who you might see online, who's in Jerusalem now. Robert Gordis wrote this, among many other books, Understanding Conservative Judaism. So there are these books. So official statements, you have Emet Ve'emunah. You have this as a reaction to the movements in Judaism, the first Jewish catalog. People who were brought up in conservative synagogues, who found the synagogue service too formal, too stifling. They started the Chavurah movement, kind of like the precursor to independent minyanim today. They wrote, here's a picture of them, what they looked like back in the late 60s and 70s. Can you see the thick hair and beards and whatnot? So they wrote the Jewish catalog. It was then only when they did the second Jewish catalog did they name this the first Jewish catalog, but it was first published as the Jewish catalog. It's kind of a do-it-yourself a do-it-yourself kit, understanding how to do. So if you want to know how to tie tzitzit, how to bake challah, how to do everything like that, why rely on stores to do it for you? Do it yourself and make it yourself. And lead your own service and stuff like that. So Richard Siegel, Michael Strassfeld, and Sharon Strassfeld did these 3 volumes, first, second, third Jewish catalog. And finally, Chancellor Arnie Eisen of the Jewish Theological Seminary, who was a sociologist at Stanford University before he became chancellor of the seminary, wrote this very thin, very readable volume, which is I'd say much more readable than Emet Ve'emunah, called Conservative Judaism Today and Tomorrow. So I highly recommend this one, and I recommend this book, Modern Conservative Judaism by Elliot Dorff. So I've worked with this one with a student, and it's very, very accessible. And this one too is an easy read, and I highly recommend this book because we're going to essentially the next several classes, the next 5 classes are going to be based on the units that are in this book. So any other questions or comments about this background before we end tonight? So.
Okay, so you talked originally about Germany and France.
Yes.
But obviously, you kind of left out the Baltic states,
Right.
Russia, and all
Right.
that. So but all of Europe were under the rule of monarchs.
Yes, but until these, okay, so Saul's asking, what about Eastern Europe and the Baltic states and Russia? All of Europe was under the rule of monarchs. They were until revolutions happened. So in France, there were monarchs until Napoleon took over after the French Revolution, right? So this movements of democracy or nationalism took over to depose the monarchs. I'm oversimplifying, I know that. So Eastern Europe was not subject to that. So Central and Western Europe slowly transformed, and these nationalist movements spread from France and Germany to the rest of Western and Central Europe. But Russia held back. So Jews in Russia were not so much under the sway of this. There were, but that's not to say that there were people in Russia, Jews in Russia, who traveled to Germany and France to study. And they brought back ideas with them to Russia. But Russia did not transform in that way. And there were pogroms in Russia that led Jews in Russia to leave and go to America. So again, I'm oversimplifying how all of this worked out, but that's why the Enlightenment, as it's called, started in France and Germany, and slowly affected the Jewish community in Russia, but not Russia itself, in terms of Jews in Russia being affected by Enlightenment. You have poets like Chaim Nachman Bialik and other scholars who are from Odessa and other places in Russia who were influenced by the scholarship of the Enlightenment, but were living in Russia, stuck in and experiencing pogroms. I mean, Bialik witnessed it in Kishinev and wrote about experiencing that there. So that's why there is the difference between these the so-called modern Jews living in France and Germany dressed like modern people, and Jews in Russia who are dressed like Jews from Russia. How they dressed also it affected how they acted as well. Any other thoughts? Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Barbara.
But prior to this time that you're saying,
Yes.
There were other movements.
There were no other movements.
What about the Hasidim?
Okay, so Barbara's talking about Hasidic. So it's not really a movement as a separate denomination as Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, or Reconstructionists. It's not. It's just a style. Hasidic Jews were just a style of how to act when praying. So Hasidic Jews still studied just like their Orthodox traditional compatriots. It's just that when they davened, they did it with more fervor. When they ate Shabbos dinner, they sang more fervently than their non-Hasidic colleagues. And so, yes, though there was debate within the traditional world about whether people should be influenced by Hasidic style or not, it was a debate about style as opposed to really a debate about substance. Okay, because nobody would deny that a Hasidic Jew wasn't Jewish or wasn't traditional. It's just that how they just preferred to pray in that way. They preferred to listen to their Magid to give them a drasha than to listen to some lecture from a Rosh Yeshiva. It's just style. It's not.
One of the things that had made it popular was the fact that you were praying in Yiddish or whatever.
I'm not so sure that's true, Barbara. I mean, there are stories about that from the Baal Shem Tov and others about like a child coming into synagogue and just reciting the Aleph Bet, and that should be a prayer for everyone. But it's not really the case that they prayed in Yiddish. No, they prayed in Hebrew, and it's just how they prayed was different than how they prayed in the yeshiva. So it's, again, this isn't a class about a difference, Hasidim versus Mitnagdim, and where we'd get into all those substantive differences, but it's not a movement like it is today in where there are Hasidic dynasties, and they're all, now you can call Hasidic Judaism, and each one, Lubavitch, Satmar, each Gerer, Bells, these are the big ones. Each in and of itself is its own family and its own kind of community that doesn't really mix with any other. That wasn't the case back when Hasidic Jews started.
Well, because when the Baal Shem Tov was alive, he was making all the rules.
Well, it's not. But again, it's not about rules, Barbara. It wasn't about rules. It's just style. It was just about style versus substance. Okay, so that will do it for the background today. We'll talk about God next month and an evolving sense of what conservative Judaism has to say about God. Have a good evening.
Thank you.